বলো
প্যারালাল ওয়ার্ল্ডের অস্তিত্ব কি আসলে আছে?
এটাও একটা থিওরিটিক্যাল কনসেপ্ট, রাইট? আরে এখন পর্যন্ত এক্সপেরিমেন্ট প্রমাণ করে নাই, বাট থিওরিটিক্যালি এই জিনিসটা দেখা যায় যে ইউনিভার্স অনেক দিন থাকা সম্ভব। আমাদের বিগ ব্যাং হয়ে আমাদের ইউনিভার্স তৈরি হয়েছে, সেরকম আরো একাধিক ইউনিভার্স হয়তো তৈরি হওয়া সম্ভব।
I'm going to say I think it's actually stronger than that.
Okay.
That what is referred to as M theory isn't even a theory. Yes. It's a collection of ideas, hopes, aspirations.
Exactly.
It's not even a theory. And I think the book is a bit misleading in that respect. It gives you the impression that here is this new theory which is going to explain everything. It's nothing of the sort.
David?
That's just that's an example.
Okay.
You mean, if the question is there any evidence for the so-called multiverse?
For multiple universes.
The answer is very simple, no.
No.
Absolutely. Yeah, the answer is there is no evidence. No evidence. No evidence. But there are reasons to think there might be. So there is, that's really important. There's no evidence for extra universes, just as there isn't the slightest bit of evidence that there are extra dimensions. But there are good theoretical reasons for people to think of these possibilities. I'll add one thing. And
That's not what I meant by my no.
Oh, that's okay. Good. But let me just say there is a way. You might think it's metaphysics, and it's really important to realize that theorists aren't doing metaphysics. And Frank alluded to it. But the point is, there are regions, there may be many universes that we can never see and never detect directly. And you might say, well, that's just metaphysics. Or worse, religion. But anyway, it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Yes.
Yeah. So I really don't want to get into this, but one aspect of this, which is the one that I find most uncomfortable, aside from the fact that it really is a word you haven't, or no one here has actually mentioned yet, the anthropic principle. So the whole attempt to make use of this notion tends to lead most people who work in that direction to anthropic arguments. Now, unfortunately, one can't prove, and if one could, the argument would end that this is logically inconsistent, unfortunately, yet. But there's something that most physicists feel, especially given the history of physics, very uncomfortable about in this set of ideas, which is independent of the anthropic principle, and that is discussing a framework in which one discusses things that are, in principle, never observable. And that is true of a vast collection of causally disconnected so-called universes. So we all feel uncomfortable with that, and we would all be greatly reassured if those who follow that direction, and some have tried, not successfully yet, to reframe this in a way that doesn't use as a conceptual framework, in principle, unobservable things. Okay. Smells of angels.
Okay.
I remember back in the 1980s telling university audiences, eventually the fine-tuning evidence for the creator God of the Bible scientifically will become so overwhelming that the non-theists will have nowhere else to go but to hypothesize an infinite number of universes where every universe is different, where they'll claim that we happen to live in the one lucky universe where everything has just the right features and characteristics. And it was none other than Leonard Susskind, an atheist theoretical physicist, said this is a terrible argument for us atheists, basically making the point that any theory that explains everything explains nothing. And that's all he said. What I've done in The Creator and the Cosmos is to give you an example of what he was talking about. That if you really have that kind of a multiverse, you're going to have an infinite variety of birch trees. And if you know anything about birch trees, they peel white pieces of bark. Well, if you've got an infinite variety of species of birch trees, one of them will be peeling pieces of white bark that measure 8.5 by 11 inches. And on an infinite number of planets, those pieces of bark will fall on soil that's got random chemicals in it that make markings on these pieces of bark that look exactly like all the equations, diagrams, letters, paragraphs that you see in every research paper published by every non-theistic scientist, which means those papers didn't come from their mind, it came from the multiverse. And that's kind of Leonard Susskind's point. You would not only be explaining away divine design, you're explaining away every human design. You have a philosophical inconsistency. But the other thing I would add, I think there is a way to put this to a positive test. If the atheistic version of the multiverse is correct, then at some point, this accumulating fine-tuning evidence will begin to go down rather than up. So if the theistic version is correct, the more we learn about the universe, the greater and greater will become the fine-tuning evidence that that creator God was responsible. But if it really is the atheistic version of the multiverse, at some point we'd expect to see declining evidence for that fine-tuning design. So what's been the track record of the past 50 years? It's always gone up. Moreover, it's not only gone up, it's gone up exponentially, which is something we document in the 4th edition of The Creator and the Cosmos.
Occam Sejere বলতেছে যে if multiple things can explain the same phenomenon, the one which is the simplest most likely is the cause.
Okay.
এটা হলো ভেরি সিম্পল এক্সপানশন। এই জন্য সায়েন্সটা যেমন অনেক যারা সায়েন্স নিয়ে পপুলার মানে স্পোক্স পারসন আছে তারা প্রায় অকাংশজনকে এক্সাম্পল নিয়ে আসে যে হুইচ ওয়ান ইজ অ্যাকচুয়ালি ট্রু। তুমি মনে করো মাল্টিপল এক্সপানশন দিছো ফর এ পার্টিকুলার ইভেন্ট, এর মধ্যে যেটা সিম্পল সেটা মোস্ট লাইকলি দ্য এক্সপানশন। এটা সায়েন্টিফিক ফিল্ডে সবাই মানে one of the axiom, এটা অলিখিত axiom, এটা আমরা নিজেরও প্র্যাকটিক্যাল লাইফে ইউজ করি।
এখানে একটা কথাই বলবো মানে খুবই রিলেভেন্ট, যে পল জেনসন, ডক্টর পল জেনসন যার কথা বললাম, যে ফার্মাসিউটিক্যাল স্টাডিজ আপনার রেভলিউশনাইজ করছে আপনার স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্স দিয়ে, অনেকগুলা মানে রুল ছিল, সেট অফ রুল আর কি। তার মধ্যে লাস্ট রুল যেটা ছিল, স্পেশালি ডেটা অ্যানালিসিস করার সময়, যে ইউজ কমন সেন্স। So common sense is built in because it's deterministic. I have to use some judgment. So common sense is inherent in statistics because আপনি যখন একটা থিওরি আনতেছেন, it has to make sense.
Hi, John Dixon here from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're talking with Professor John Lennox of Oxford about science, God, and the multiverse. John, you've made much, and in fact many scientists have made much of the fine-tuning argument that the universe seems to have these extraordinarily precise details in it that have produced life. The out clause for those who don't want there to be a God is to propose that there are many universes, millions of universes, the so-called multiverse theory. Firstly, can you explain that for those who aren't comfortable with that notion? And then I want to ask you a couple of questions about it.
I'm very interested in the way you put the question, the out clause for those who don't want there to be a God. Because there is a suspicion around that it's not just science that's driving this agenda, that it really is an attempt to get an out clause. Indeed, Professor Sir Martin Rees, our astronomer royal, has written a book called Just Six Numbers. And he discusses these 6 numbers, which are numbers connected with the fundamental constants of the universe. And he points out that they have to be just right in order to have a universe in which carbon-based life can develop. That's really the fine-tuning argument. We're in a very special universe. You can see it at a trivial level. If we were any nearer to the sun in our orbit, carbon-based life would be impossible because of the heat. Any further away, impossible because of the cold. If the Earth rotated any faster, there'd be no atmosphere. We get a free trip into space. If it rotated slower, we'd boil to death in the day and freeze to death at night. So even at a simple level, it's special. But when physicists talk about the fundamental constants of nature, and particularly the values they have to have in the origin of the universe, the hot Big Bang, then the probabilities, the accuracy has to be astonishingly small. Paul Davis, a very eminent person who works here in Australia, theoretical physicist, said getting it right is a bit like hitting a 1 centimeter square target with a gun when the target is at the far side of the visible universe. You know, that kind of thing. That's what we mean by the fine-tuning argument. So people come along like Sir Martin Rees and say, yes, it is very surprising, but the surprise gets lost if you imagine there to be a possibly infinite ensemble of universes, they say, in which everything that can possibly take place does take place. Then you oughtn't to be surprised to find yourself in a universe like this, because after all, this is the only kind of universe you can find yourself in. Now, Martin Rees in his book says something like this. He said, the alternative to this multiverse is the creator, and he prefers the multiverse. Now that sounds a little bit like your formulation of the question in terms of an out clause. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt, shall we? That here are two alternative views. What about this multiverse? Well, first of all, we learn from these scientists that all these other universes are completely inaccessible to us. There's no real evidence that they exist. And in fact, some leading quantum physicists like Sir John Polkinghorne just think it's fantasy. And he says it's far more economical, if you want to use some kind of philosophical tool like Occam's razor, principle of economy of hypotheses, to have one single God responsible for this universe rather than multi-millions of universes that are inaccessible to us.
That's interesting, because having just read Richard Dawkins on this question, he says the opposite. He says postulating multiple millions of universes is the simpler option. Far more complex is an idea such that there's an intelligent being.
Yes, well, is it? Postulating multi-millions or an infinite number, whatever that means, of universes sounds a very complex thing, because you see, some of those universes are bound to be very much more complex than this one. I think Dawkins has forgotten that we live in a pretty complex universe to start with, so that's part of the multiverse. And others must be, by definition, because it includes all possible ones, much more complicated than this one, you see. Alvin Plantinga has got a lovely little codicil on this. He's one of the world's leading philosophers in Notre Dame in the States. He says that Dawkins at least admits the possibility there's a God. It's a very remote possibility because God is improbable. So, but if possible, since every possible universe exists, then there must be a universe in which God exists. But then there's only one universe, and the whole thing collapses, which I think is rather nice. Keith Ward adds, he's the professor, a Regius Professor of Theology, of Divinity at Oxford. He adds the point that the multiverse also creates all kinds of moral problems. You know, there's a universe in which I'm a decent chap. There's another universe in which I'm a thug or a criminal, and so on. And that kind of thing has led a number of philosophers to be extremely skeptical, especially since the scientific evidence just isn't there. But it's worth looking at another consideration, and that is John Leslie's argument. You see, all these probabilities that they're talking about that have to be fine-tuned are in this universe. So this is happening in this universe. And one of my friends, a philosopher of physics in Oxford, and he says the element of surprise doesn't reduce when you bring in a multiverse, because these things are happening live in this universe. Here are all these probabilities that just have to be right. Now, Leslie's analogy, which bears some thinking about, is suppose at this very moment, and for all I know it may well be that some of your viewers feel exactly like this, suppose I've got 1,000 guns trained on me in a firing squad, and you say to me as the compere of this program, John, you oughtn't to be surprised to find yourself alive after they all shoot, because after all, that's the only thing you could experience. I might retort and say, John, I'd be very surprised if they all missed. In other words, you don't reduce that element of surprise. And John Leslie has done an interesting job in his book, and he's not a Christian, in his book called Universes, in teasing this out. So the multiverse theory sounds very impressive, but once you begin to see the evidence is missing, whereas on the other hand, I would want to argue that there's a great deal of evidence for one God, an intelligence behind the universe, then I think that the multiverse theory has not got too much going for it, really. Final point is, of course, if there is a God, he's perfectly capable of creating a multiverse. You see, again, philosophically, introducing a multiverse is not in itself an argument against God. It's an argument, it purports to be an argument against a certain collection of small probabilities. It's not an argument against God.
And that the best hope for believing in a multiverse would be theism. On a naturalistic view, you run into this Boltzmann brain problem that the vast majority of observable worlds in the multiverse would be worlds in which a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the vacuum and observes its otherwise empty world. Those kind of worlds are so much simpler, so much more probable than a world that's finely tuned for embodied interactive observers. So if we were just a random member of a multiverse, naturalistically construed, it would seem that we ought to be Boltzmann brains. So if being.
How about in quantum mechanics? As you know, there is something called branching or differentiation, where at every Planck time, as they say, there's a branching of or differentiation of the world. So there's infinite numbers of us talking in different ways with very slight differences, and then you have a multiplicity of these quantum mechanical worlds.
That's one way in which theorists have thought to generate a world ensemble of universes, though I think that most quantum physicists would regard this as an extraordinarily implausible interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Cosmologists talk about a multiverse, innumerable universes. Do you think God created a multiverse?
I must confess, Robert, that I'm very skeptical of this metaphysical hypothesis. I think that if we were just one random member of a world ensemble of worlds or universes, that we would be observing a very different kind of universe than we in fact do.
What would that look like?
It should include all sorts of improbable and absurd events that don't happen, because in an infinite ensemble of worlds, if you can get the events so improbable as the fine-tuning of the cosmological constant, the low entropy state, and so forth, then you should also get highly improbable events like a perpetual motion machine and rabbits wearing pink bow ties and so forth, because those are less improbable than the finely tuned constants and quantities.
Well, theoretically, those are occurring in other parts of this world ensemble.
But if...
Just not in ours.
Well, but if we are just a randomly ordered member of this ensemble, such that the probability is that somewhere these constants would be finely tuned, then things that are even less improbable ought also to be appearing conjointly. And yet we see a rationally ordered universe, and that cries out for some sort of explanation. In addition to that, a much smaller inflationary patch would be sufficient for our existence, rather than the large universe we see. And it is overwhelmingly more probable that if we were just a random member of a world ensemble, we should be observing a much smaller inflationary patch than what we do in fact observe. And I think this is really the Achilles heel in this multiverse hypothesis, that if we were just a member of a multiverse, randomly ordered, then it is overwhelmingly more probable we ought to be seeing a very different kind of universe than the rationally ordered world that we do in fact see.
Quote, "The more I examine the universe and study the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known that we were coming. Without fine-tuning, our universe would be a horror story even Stephen King couldn't imagine."
the very construction of the world and the fact that we seem to be the only blue populated planet in the universe, it makes you have to believe that if we happened by accident, it would make winning the lottery look like flipping a coin. So I have a tendency to believe in intelligent design.
Nobel Prize-winning physicist Charles Townes seemed to agree by stating, and I quote, "Intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. This is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way."
As possible ways of generating new universes themselves require fine-tuning. So in order to explain the fine-tuning, you have to posit prior universe-generating mechanisms that themselves require fine-tuning.
And so, in the end, you're left right where you started.